The moment the black CEO was removed from his luxury seat, it was not just an act of inconvenience, it was an incident loaded with symbolism, a clash of perception, and an unspoken reminder of how society still struggles with its deepest prejudices. As the cabin buzzed with travelers eager to embark on their journey, no one expected that the seating arrangement would become the centerpiece of the flight, but when the flight attendant approached the CEO with a forced smile masking discomfort, tension quietly settled into the atmosphere. He had checked in, presented his boarding pass, and taken his rightful place in the plush seat that was meant for him, a space he had earned through hard work, persistence, and undeniable success. Yet, within moments, that very seat was questioned, as though his presence in it was an anomaly that needed correction. The words from the staff carried authority but trembled with the awkwardness of what was about to unfold, requesting that he give up his seat so another passenger could occupy it, a white traveler whose presence was seemingly prioritized without explanation. Every detail of the exchange carried weight. The subtle hesitation before the announcement, the way the attendant avoided direct eye contact, and the hushed whispers of nearby passengers all reflected that something was wrong. To the CEO, the luxury seat was not just leather cushioning and extra space, it was a symbol of how far he had come, a seat that echoed the countless hours of struggle, the sacrifices he had made, the barriers he had broken, and the glass ceilings he had shattered. Being asked to surrender it in such a public manner was not just a logistical request, it was a stripping of recognition, a gesture that seemed to question his worthiness to sit there in the first place. His calm demeanor masked an internal storm, and while he complied outwardly, his silent composure was in itself a profound statement. For the passengers around him, the moment unfolded like a drama they never purchased tickets for. Eyes darted from the CEO to the attendant, from the white traveler waiting to be seated to the cabin crew silently watching. Some pretended to look away, burying themselves in their books, headphones, or mobile screens, but the energy of discomfort could not be ignored. Others stared openly, shocked that such an act was occurring in plain sight. Whispers carried questions: why him, why now, and what made his seat negotiable in the first place? The murmur of voices became a quiet background track to an act that spoke volumes without needing a single explanation. The white traveler, who was the beneficiary of this sudden shift, moved forward with a blend of entitlement and hesitation. His expression suggested that he was aware of the privilege being extended to him, though whether he acknowledged it or chose to ignore it was unclear. Each step he took toward that seat etched deeper into the minds of those who witnessed the event, solidifying the contrast between perception and reality. The scene became larger than travel logistics, it became a reflection of society's invisible lines, the unspoken hierarchies that still dictate who is deemed more deserving, even when everything on paper proves otherwise. The CEO's removal from his seat was not accompanied by a loud protest, no dramatic outburst, no resistance that could be twisted into a spectacle. Instead, his quiet compliance drew more attention than a confrontation could have. By rising and stepping away, he left behind not just an empty seat, but also a silence so heavy that it made the leather cushions seem colder. That silence pressed on everyone in the cabin, forcing them to wrestle with the truth of what they had just seen. The passengers who might have previously believed that such acts belonged to another era now sat in disbelief, confronted with the uncomfortable reality that such moments still exist, disguised in politeness and procedural tone. The symbolic weight of the incident extended beyond the cabin. It wasn't merely about a seat or comfort, it was about representation, about the unspoken assumption that even success, wealth, and power could be brushed aside when old biases reared their heads. The CEO, despite embodying the pinnacle of professional accomplishment, was still vulnerable to being diminished in an instant. This realization gnawed at those who understood the implications. They saw not just a man displaced from a chair, but a leader being displaced from recognition, a human being forced to carry the weight of injustice silently in front of strangers who would remember this far longer than the flight itself. Passengers felt a mix of emotions, some angry, some ashamed, some unsure whether to speak up or stay quiet. A handful shifted uncomfortably in their seats, caught between complicity and the risk of confrontation. The atmosphere inside the cabin became heavier with every second, as if the very air had been infused with the tension of an unspoken truth. The CEO's composure, his stillness, and the grace with which he carried himself made the contrast even sharper, reminding everyone that dignity in the face of humiliation carries a force stronger than words. The removal from that luxury seat was more than an act of displacement, it was the beginning of a story that demanded reflection from every single person who witnessed it, a moment that pierced through the ordinary rhythms of travel and revealed the fragile state of equality when tested in real time. The visible discomfort and reactions of fellow passengers began the moment the CEO was asked to leave his seat. It was as though the cabin had been transformed into a stage, and every passenger suddenly became part of an unplanned play that none of them had rehearsed for. People who had been casually flipping through magazines or scrolling on their phones suddenly froze, their attention pulled into the tension radiating from the front of the cabin. A murmur of disbelief ran quietly among the rows, whispers escaping lips as eyes darted toward the man in the tailored suit who was being asked to vacate the very seat he had rightfully earned. What stood out most was not the act itself, but the silence that followed, a silence that seemed to demand a reaction from every single person sitting there. Some passengers shifted in their seats, avoiding eye contact with the CEO or the flight attendants, as though acknowledging the moment would implicate them in it. Others leaned forward with curiosity, their brows furrowed, trying to understand why such a thing was happening. A few shook their heads in subtle disapproval, though no words were spoken aloud. The quiet discontent hovered over the cabin like an invisible fog, thick and undeniable, pressing down on everyone present. Even the hum of the engine seemed to fade into the background, replaced by the uncomfortable awareness that they were witnessing something unfair, something unsettling, something that did not align with the polished image of luxury travel they had paid for. The reactions varied not just in silence but in body language. One woman clutched her armrest tighter, glancing at her companion with an expression that asked the question she could not voice. A man a few rows back crossed his arms, staring openly as though his steady gaze alone could challenge the injustice. A young traveler, perhaps experiencing luxury class for the first time, looked bewildered, her innocence making her more transparent in her discomfort. Every glance, every frown, every shifting posture told a story of its own, each a fragment of the collective unease that was now gripping the cabin. There were passengers who felt compelled to whisper their thoughts. A pair of colleagues muttered to each other about how unbelievable it was that someone so polished, so evidently successful, could be asked to step aside. Another passenger leaned toward his partner and questioned why no explanation had been given, why the man was being displaced as if he did not belong. These hushed tones carried weight, even though they never rose to challenge the authority of the crew. The whispers were safe, private outlets for indignation that dared not spill into open defiance. That very restraint made the discomfort sharper, because it reflected a fear of confrontation that mirrored society at large, seeing injustice, recognizing it, but hesitating to raise a voice against it. At the same time, there were passengers whose silence seemed to lean the other way. They accepted the exchange without protest, their expressions blank, their focus quickly redirected to screens or books, eager to distance themselves from the awkwardness unfolding nearby. Their quiet compliance carried a different kind of weight, one that spoke to the normalization of such events, as if to them this was not a disruption but simply another example of how the world operates. For them, the moment may have been fleeting, but for those more attuned to its deeper meaning, the silence felt heavy, almost complicit. The white traveler who benefited from the exchange added another layer to the tension. His steps forward toward the seat carried with them an unspoken commentary on entitlement, whether intentional or not. Some passengers noticed the way his eyes avoided the CEO's, others noticed the stiffness in his shoulders as though even he felt the discomfort of the moment. Yet his acceptance of the seat without hesitation became part of the tableau, a decision that only magnified the unease of those who watched. The sight of him settling into the plush leather while the CEO stood aside etched itself into the minds of those present, a visual contrast that required no words to communicate the imbalance of power at play. The discomfort was not only visible in gestures but also in the atmosphere itself. What had been an ordinary flight just minutes earlier now carried the stillness of a room holding its breath. It was the kind of silence that does not come from peace but from suppressed voices, from the weight of something that feels wrong but remains unaddressed. Every small sound, the click of a seatbelt, the rustle of a magazine page, the metallic clink of a glass being set down, was amplified against the backdrop of quiet tension. The passengers were not just witnesses, they were participants in a moment of collective awareness, a moment that would linger in their memories long after the plane landed. For those seated nearby, the image of the CEO rising and leaving his seat became more than a single man's experience. It became a mirror reflecting the values of those around him, forcing each passenger to confront where they stood in the spectrum of reaction: silent disapproval, whispered commentary, passive compliance, or perhaps even quiet agreement with what had happened. The discomfort was visible not because anyone shouted or protested, but because no one did. The absence of open reaction became the loudest statement of all, and that silence wrapped around the cabin like an unspoken agreement to let the moment pass, even as every soul aboard carried its weight in their eyes and in their conscience. The silent power of dignity in the face of humiliation was the most striking element of that moment, because while the removal of the CEO carried all the markings of unfairness, his response was the part that etched itself into the minds of everyone present. He did not raise his voice, did not argue with the crew, did not attempt to prove his worthiness for the seat he had rightfully purchased. Instead, he chose silence, a silence that carried more strength than any loud protest could have. His calm presence, the measured way he gathered his belongings, the steady look in his eyes that neither flinched nor pleaded, created an atmosphere that made the injustice even more visible. It was as though his refusal to descend into anger illuminated the wrongness of the act more powerfully than shouting ever could. Humiliation often seeks to provoke a reaction. Those who diminish others, whether intentionally or through unconscious bias, rely on the expectation that the person on the receiving end will react in a way that justifies the treatment. Anger, resistance, loud confrontation, all of these are easier to dismiss than quiet composure. The CEO seemed to know this instinctively, or perhaps it was a wisdom born of years navigating spaces where he was often the only black man in the room, where he had learned that control over one's demeanor can become a shield. His silence was not submission, it was a weapon of its own, a refusal to let the moment define him through chaos. Passengers noticed this power in his stillness. Some were visibly moved by the restraint, by the fact that even while being displaced, he carried himself with the same authority he had when seated in that luxury chair. His posture remained upright, his movements deliberate, his face unreadable but not defeated. This visible dignity contrasted so sharply with the actions that led to his removal that it created a quiet indictment of the situation itself. Without saying a word, he reminded everyone in that cabin that dignity cannot be stripped away by taking a seat, that self-respect is not dependent on material positioning but on inner strength. The white traveler who slid into the seat may have thought he gained something, but the difference in presence between him and the CEO was noticeable to all. Where one sat with physical privilege, the other stood with moral authority. That comparison was impossible to ignore, and it lingered in the expressions of passengers who glanced between the two men. Some saw it as a lesson unfolding before their eyes, that real leadership is not about occupying the best seat in the room, but about how one carries oneself when forced to leave it. The power of dignity also shifted the atmosphere of the cabin in a way words could not. Passengers who might have been on the fence about speaking up or staying silent found themselves rethinking their own responses. His calmness forced them to reflect on their own discomfort, to recognize that sometimes silence is not weakness but strength, that refusing to be shaken by humiliation reveals more about a person's character than outward defiance. A few passengers lowered their eyes, not out of indifference but because they felt the weight of their own inaction, realizing that the man who had just been wronged was demonstrating more courage than any of them had in their whispered judgments or subtle disapprovals. What makes dignity powerful is its ability to leave a lasting imprint. Long after the moment ended, passengers would remember how he carried himself more than the act that displaced him. They would recall his stillness, the quiet way he moved, the unspoken message that reverberated through his silence. His reaction transformed the incident from a story of humiliation into a story of resilience. In a space where he was denied fairness, he created his own victory by refusing to allow others to dictate his value. The flight attendants too, though bound by procedure, could not ignore the force of his silence. They may have carried on with their duties, but inside they must have felt the sting of what they had been complicit in. The CEO's lack of visible anger denied them the comfort of dismissing him as difficult or disruptive. Instead, his restraint exposed the act for what it truly was, unjust and unnecessary. His calmness left no excuses to hide behind, and that truth lingered with greater intensity than any confrontation could have achieved. This dignity in the face of humiliation also resonated with deeper historical echoes that many passengers could not ignore. It carried with it the weight of centuries where silence and composure were sometimes the only tools available against systemic disrespect. But here, in this luxury cabin, it was not silence born of powerlessness but silence chosen deliberately, silence that said, "You can take the seat, but you cannot take me." It was a reminder that true dignity is unshakable, that it resides in the person, not in the position, and that when displayed under pressure, it has the ability to humble even those who benefit from injustice. The lesson was written not in words but in actions. His quiet refusal to be reduced by humiliation told everyone watching that strength is not always loud, that sometimes it is the ability to hold your head high when others expect you to bow it. The passengers, the crew, even the man who took his seat were left with that image burned into their memory. Dignity, shown in its purest form, became the loudest voice in a cabin that had fallen into silence. The unexpected twist that revealed true character came when the silence of the cabin began to give way to something no one anticipated. What started as a scene of quiet humiliation slowly transformed into a moment that stripped away facades and laid bare the essence of the people involved. The CEO, who had carried himself with calm dignity, seemed to draw even more attention after leaving his seat than he ever did while sitting in it. His presence, though displaced physically, grew larger in the moral space of the cabin. Every movement he made, every moment he stood there without bitterness or visible anger, became a mirror for everyone else, reflecting not just their opinions but their true character. The twist emerged not in grand gestures but in the small, almost invisible cracks of human behavior. A passenger who had stayed silent at first eventually stood and offered his own seat, unable to endure the weight of watching injustice play out unchallenged. Another, who had earlier turned away, suddenly leaned forward to speak words of quiet support, acknowledging that what had happened was wrong. These small acts, though hesitant, were not about seating arrangements anymore, they were about conscience breaking through the surface. The cabin, once filled with whispers of discomfort, began to carry a different energy, one in which the true nature of people was revealed through how they responded to an unfair moment. For the white traveler who had taken the seat, the twist was even more personal. Sitting in comfort did not bring him peace. The eyes of the other passengers, the lingering image of the CEO's composure, and the weight of silence pressing against him made the seat feel heavier than it should. What was meant to be an upgrade began to feel like a burden. His character was revealed not by the privilege he received but by how he carried it. The unease in his posture, the lack of ease in his smile, betrayed the truth that comfort gained at the expense of another's dignity never sits well. Without speaking a word, his discomfort told a story of its own, a reminder that entitlement exposes character when privilege is tested. The twist also reached the crew. For the attendants who had executed the decision, their professionalism became stained with an inner conflict they could not easily hide. Their rehearsed politeness, their neutral expressions, began to falter in the face of the CEO's quiet strength. The longer the flight went on, the more their actions revealed who they were beneath the uniform. Some avoided his gaze altogether, perhaps out of guilt, while others softened in their demeanor, as though silently apologizing through small gestures of service. Their character was no longer hidden behind protocol, it was revealed in how they adjusted to the weight of what had just occurred. What stood out most was that the CEO himself became the true center of the cabin without occupying the prized seat. His restraint, his refusal to break under humiliation, created a ripple effect that forced everyone to reveal themselves. The twist was that the man who was stripped of his place became the one who held the most influence in the room. In losing a seat, he gained an authority that could not be purchased, a respect that could not be demanded, and a presence that overshadowed the privilege of the very person who replaced him. It was a reversal that left everyone silently acknowledging a truth they had not expected to see so clearly. Character is most visible under pressure, and this moment revealed layers of it in unexpected ways. Some passengers, previously silent, revealed cowardice in their refusal to acknowledge the wrong. Others revealed courage in small but meaningful acts of kindness. The crew revealed the tension between following orders and recognizing humanity. The white traveler revealed how entitlement can weigh heavier than fairness. And the CEO revealed what true leadership looks like, not in holding power or position, but in refusing to be diminished by the loss of it. The twist was not about who sat where but about who stood taller, and in that moment, the cabin became less about luxury and more about humanity laid bare. The impact of this twist was felt in the unspoken acknowledgement among passengers. People began to exchange glances, no longer just at the CEO but at one another, as though silently questioning what they themselves would have done in his place. The flight had started like any other, but now it carried with it the atmosphere of a moral test. The characters of everyone involved were no longer hidden in casual anonymity, they were revealed in how they chose to respond to injustice that played out in front of them. Some found themselves proud of their instinct to support, while others wrestled with shame for having stayed quiet. What no one expected was that the CEO's loss of a seat would turn into a gain of respect that filled the entire cabin. The twist revealed that the value of a person is never measured by the leather seat they occupy but by the strength they display when stripped of it. In this way, the cabin turned into a lesson, not about travel, but about the unveiling of true character in a moment of trial. The lasting impact of this incident on everyone present was not something that could be measured in the minutes of the flight alone, because the memory of what unfolded stayed with each person in a way they could not easily shake. For some, it became a story they would tell in hushed tones long after landing, a reminder of a moment when the illusion of fairness cracked in front of their eyes. For others, it became a private reflection, something that stirred inside them quietly, reshaping the way they viewed the world and their place within it. The power of the incident was that it did not end when the CEO moved from his seat, nor did it conclude when the white traveler sat down. Its true weight came from the way it lingered in the minds of the passengers, weaving itself into their conscience long after the engines went quiet and the flight came to an end. For those who had whispered their discomfort during the moment, the impact grew heavier with time. At first, their silence had felt like the safer choice, a way to avoid confrontation in a setting where rules and authority often dominate. But later, when they replayed the incident in their minds, they began to feel the sting of regret. They thought about the dignity with which the CEO carried himself and wondered why they had not found the courage to speak up. That regret, though painful, carried the potential to change them, to make them more aware in future moments where silence feels like complicity. The incident became a marker for them, a reminder that opportunities to stand up for fairness often arrive without warning, and that failing to act leaves a residue of guilt that lingers. For the passengers who had chosen to act, even in small ways, the impact was equally lasting. The one who offered his seat, the one who whispered words of support, the one who made eye contact with the CEO as if to silently acknowledge the wrong, all of them carried forward a sense of affirmation that they had chosen the harder path, even if their actions had been subtle. Their gestures may not have reversed the injustice, but they revealed something about their own character, and the memory of their choice became a quiet source of strength. They learned that even in small measures, courage has the power to disrupt silence, and that doing something, however small, is better than standing by as if nothing happened. The impact on the white traveler who had taken the seat was different but no less significant. Comfort is supposed to feel satisfying, but in his case, it became a seat lined with unease. The glances of passengers, the silent dignity of the CEO, and the tension that lingered around him turned what should have been a privilege into a mirror reflecting his own choices. Even if he never admitted it out loud, the experience would likely stay with him, a reminder of how hollow privilege feels when it comes at the cost of fairness. The seat itself may have been comfortable, but the weight of occupying it under those circumstances became a lesson he could not easily escape. The crew, too, carried the impact with them. Their role in enforcing the decision made them complicit in the humiliation, and though they had followed orders, the memory of the CEO's silence would not be erased by procedure. For some, it may have sparked a quiet questioning of how rules are applied and who they truly serve. For others, it may have awakened a recognition of their own humanity, reminding them that authority without empathy can wound deeply. The professionalism they maintained on the outside did not shield them from the realization that they had been part of a moment that exposed bias, and that awareness would follow them into future flights, shaping how they handled similar situations. But perhaps the greatest impact was felt in the collective memory of the cabin. Every passenger left with an image that stayed etched in their minds: a successful black man standing calmly after being asked to give up the seat he had earned, his dignity shining brighter than the leather chair he was forced to abandon. That image became a story they carried forward into their conversations, their reflections, and their understanding of the world. It was no longer just about one man and one flight, it became about the broader truth that injustice can surface anywhere, even in spaces meant to symbolize equality and luxury. The incident turned the flight into more than a journey across distance, it became a journey of awareness, one that each passenger would continue long after they stepped off the plane. The CEO himself was not unaffected, though his calm exterior suggested otherwise. For him, the impact was layered, a mixture of the familiar sting of bias and the renewed affirmation of his own strength. Incidents like this were not new to him, but each time they occurred, they left a mark, a reminder of the work still left to be done. Yet his ability to carry himself with dignity also reaffirmed his own values, his refusal to let humiliation define him. His composure was not only for himself but also for those watching, for those who needed to see that dignity can outlast injustice. The incident left him with the knowledge that his reaction had transformed the meaning of the event, turning it from an act of humiliation into a lesson in strength for everyone present. The lasting impact of the incident was not confined to the cabin but extended into the lives of everyone who had been there. In conversations with friends and family, in moments of private reflection, in the choices they would make in future encounters with unfairness, the memory of that flight would resurface. It would serve as a quiet reminder that dignity in the face of injustice is powerful, but that silence from bystanders carries its own consequences. The event became more than a single story, it became a collective experience that would ripple outward, shaping perspectives, influencing actions, and reminding everyone that true leadership and respect are not tied to status or position, but to how one responds when tested. ChatGPT said, "The powerful lesson about respect, equality, and leadership came alive in a way that theory and speeches alone could never capture, because this was not a story told in a classroom or written in a book, it was a real moment lived out in front of dozens of witnesses, each of whom left with a truth etched into their memory." The lesson began with the contrast between the external circumstances and the internal reality. On the surface, it was just a seating arrangement, a shift in who occupied a luxury chair, but beneath that surface, it was about something much deeper: who is considered worthy of respect, how equality is honored or denied in practice, and what real leadership looks like when one is tested. Respect is often spoken of as something automatic, a courtesy extended to everyone regardless of their status or background. Yet the incident revealed that respect is still conditional in many spaces, filtered through the lens of perception and bias. The CEO had every credential, every right, and every reason to be in that seat, but the decision to move him suggested that his presence there was somehow negotiable. It exposed the uncomfortable truth that respect is not always granted equally, that society still carries unspoken hierarchies about who belongs where. Passengers who witnessed this learned, perhaps in a way they had never confronted before, that respect is not only about manners or politeness but about recognition, about affirming the rightful place of a person without hesitation or compromise. The CEO's calm reaction became a stark reminder that respect, when denied, speaks louder about those who withhold it than about the one who is denied. Equality, too, found its lesson in this moment. On paper, equality meant that anyone who purchased a ticket, regardless of race or background, was entitled to the same treatment and the same seat they paid for. Yet the reality of the incident revealed how fragile that promise still is, how quickly it can be bent by bias, by comfort with the familiar, or by unspoken assumptions about who deserves priority. For many passengers, seeing the CEO displaced became a confrontation with the gap between principle and practice. They realized that equality is not a given but something that must be actively upheld, because without vigilance, it slips away silently in moments just like this. The incident became a living illustration that equality is not tested in policies and slogans but in the everyday choices made by individuals in positions of authority, choices that either affirm or undermine fairness. Leadership, however, was the lesson that shone brightest in the aftermath. The CEO, stripped of his seat, could have responded with anger, could have raised his voice, could have demanded justice in a way that turned the cabin into a scene of confrontation. But instead, he chose composure, carrying himself with the quiet authority of someone who knows that true leadership is not about controlling circumstances but about controlling oneself in the midst of them. His dignity transformed the meaning of the event. He did not need the seat to prove his worth, his leadership was proven in the way he responded when stripped of it. The passengers who watched understood in that moment that leadership is not about position but about presence, not about power but about principle. The powerful lesson was not taught with words but with silence. Silence became the canvas upon which the truth was drawn. Passengers learned that respect is hollow if it wavers under pressure, that equality is fragile if not fiercely protected, and that leadership shines brightest when dignity is maintained in the face of humiliation. Each person aboard the flight absorbed that lesson in their own way. Some carried it with regret, knowing they had stayed silent when they could have spoken. Others carried it with inspiration, having seen what it looks like to remain unshaken in the face of injustice. All carried it with memory, an image of a man displaced from a seat but elevated in stature far beyond the confines of that cabin. The lesson about respect resonated deeply with those who had once believed that wealth, success, or titles could shield a person from bias. They realized that respect must go deeper than surface achievements, that it must be rooted in the recognition of shared humanity. The lesson about equality resonated with those who had taken it for granted, who believed that modern times had erased such moments. They saw, with their own eyes, that equality is still something fragile, something that requires awareness and courage to defend. The lesson about leadership resonated with everyone, because it reminded them that leadership is not about avoiding hardship but about rising above it with integrity intact. The incident transformed a flight into a classroom and the cabin into a stage where every passenger became both witness and student. No one left untouched by the lesson. It was felt in the regret of silence, in the courage of small gestures, in the unease of privilege, and in the quiet strength of dignity. It was a lesson that could not be dismissed or forgotten, because it had been lived in real time, unfolding not as a speech or a lecture but as a truth carried in the actions of those involved. Respect, equality, and leadership revealed themselves not as abstract ideals but as living realities that demand to be practiced, defended, and embodied.